Okay, welcome everybody to another Holistic Health Zoom call. We have a number of questions that you submitted that we'll be going over, so let's get to those. Remember in the rules with the questions, just because you ask a question, it might not get answered. If it doesn't, please do submit it again. Um, because I don't go back to the initial questions of 3 weeks ago to look at them. So if your question did get answered and is still having difficulty getting help with something, just submit that question again. We're getting more and more questions, and we are limited to how many that we can answer on our calls. First question, I'm dealing with mast cell. So mast cell activation, this person means. Everybody has mast cells in their body. If they're hyperactivated or they're overactivated, then we end up with an excess amount of histamine production. That's one of the things that mast cells produce is inflammatory cytokines. So doing a good diet and using HistaClear, concerned about getting rid of mold and heavy metals. I'm really not sure what binders to use. I have no gallbladder. I have autoimmune Lyme issues and would like to use a Rife machine. So a Rife machine is really one of the best tools for autoimmune Lyme issues, because any other immune stimulants, if you have any autoimmune disease, whether it be Lyme related, thyroid, brain inflammation, whatever chronic symptoms you have, and if a person does have really chronic symptoms that they've had for a long time, almost guarantee that they're in an autoimmune phase. And using less immune stimulators can be better for you, because anytime you're going to use an immune stimulator, it will activate mast cells and will produce increased cytokines. So the more that you can get away from nutritional immune stimulators, the better off you're going to be. And using a Rife can be really good for that. So if you have Lyme disease, you can run the Rife for Lyme disease itself, or you can run the Rife to help decrease inflammation. There's programs out there to decrease swelling, decrease inflammation, so they can be very beneficial. But back up to this first part of the question, concerned about getting rid of mold and heavy metals. So if you have mast cell activation, there can be multiple, and almost always is multiple reasons. Now we want to blame it on one thing, like, oh, I have mold, or oh, I have Lyme disease, that's why. But it's almost always multiple things going on. Testing for food sensitivities can be a good idea. Testing your house for mold can be a really good idea. Testing your body for heavy metals can be a good idea, though it's not super accurate. So all those things can be good. The best binder to use, to me, is really our clear binder. To me, that's the best binder because it's the best balanced binder we have. And you could just take a couple a day of those. It's not really, you can't overdose on binders because you're really not absorbing much of the binder anyhow. So that's the idea. It's grabbing onto things in your gut and helping calm down your gut. Is detoxing with the Rife machine easier on your body and organs than using supplements? Well, back to the kind of ties into the earlier question. It really depends on if the person has an autoimmune disease. So it's good to do them both together. So with the Rife machine, if you do have a Rife machine, the benefit of that is you have the Ion Pro Wave if you're talking about having the Rife machine from us. So that's the true Rife, and you have the Ion Pro Wave with that, and that's the foot bath apparatus that can really help with detoxification. So it's a really nice thing to have. It can take some pressure off your body. Also think of other things that can take pressure off your body, which when you're talking about having an autoimmune disease, think of using a sauna. That could be very beneficial because it'll help you detox through your skin. And think about doing coffee enemas. So nobody really likes to talk about coffee enemas, but they are really, really helpful because they'll really support your detox pathways, your parasympathetic nervous system, and everything. is it possible that my 9 siblings could have some of the same defect genes I have? It's not only possible, but it's highly probable. So when you have, let's say you have, so you have alleles, right? How do I spell this right? I think that's how you spell this. An allele is what you're looking at. You have 2 alleles to each gene. So you either have a single allele defect or a double allele defect. If you have a double allele defect, you got one of those from your mother and you got one of those from your father. So if you have a double allele defect, meaning it has a 2 on it, so on your gene report, it has a 2 or a 1. So that means you either have a 1 as a single allele defect, so you could have got it from your mother or your father. If you have a double allele defect or a 2 on there, that means your mother and your father have at least a single allele defect. So that means each one of your siblings could receive that as well. So higher chance if you have a 2 that your siblings would have at least a 1. If you have a 2, your siblings will actually have at least a 1. Not all of them will have a 2 though. So if your father was a 2 and your mother was a 2, then every offspring will have a 2. If your mother was a 1 and your father was a 2, then every offspring will have a 2. So it kind of goes like that, so you can kind of figure it out. So some people don't do genetics on their children. If they did genetics on, both the mom and the dad, they can kind of figure out pretty good certainty where my child is at. Saves them a little bit of money. But as far as siblings, it's probably best to do genetic workup on each one of them. Also, if caffeine gene is not highlighted, does this mean it's okay to drink caffeine? Yes, that's correct. So if I didn't highlight it, then you could go ahead and drink some caffeine. Again, understand that, okay, so with the food genes, like the caffeine genes and the genes for dairy and the genes for gluten, that it does not mean, just because you don't have any genes for gluten, so it does not mean that you don't have food sensitivities and you don't have antibodies for gluten. Same thing with caffeine. Caffeine is a food that you could actually have antibodies against caffeine, so you could have a food sensitivity to caffeine, but not have any genetic predispositions to having issues with caffeine. So they're totally, completely different. So I could have perfectly clean genes for gluten, but I have antibodies to gluten. So every time I eat gluten, I'm causing an inflammatory reaction. So don't equate genetic issues with food to food sensitivities due to antibody creation of the food particle, the food peptide. Also, the oxalate pathway is not highlighted, even though my kidney stones are oxalate based, right? So if you don't have a lot of oxalate gene defects, that doesn't mean that you're still don't have the ability to get kidney stones. Almost all kidney stones, most kidney stones are oxalate based. But if you have issues with your oxalate pathway, you have a much higher chance of getting kidney stones. But just because you don't have issues with your oxalate pathway doesn't mean you still won't get kidney stones, because there's other factors involved. You're going to have oxalates in your diet. So it's how well you get rid of them. So your genetics play a part in how well you get rid of oxalates, but also your diet. If it's super high in oxalates, or you're dehydrated, that's a huge piece of it. You're dehydrated, chance of you're getting kidney stones goes up as well. All right. Mushrooms are high in glutamates. If so, if I take Histoclear when I eat them rarely, would that be okay? Yes. And I would not worry about, unless you are like a mushroom connoisseur and you eat them like gorge on mushrooms, you don't have to worry about mushrooms. The glutamate and oxalate and histamine in mushrooms is, I wouldn't be too concerned about that, especially if you're eating them rarely. Could you tell me more about the BRCA and the MCY genes? There wasn't more information except that curcumin would help. So there's lots of different BRCA genes and the MCY genes. These are tumor suppressor genes. So tumor suppressor genes turn on when when a cell starts rapidly replicating. So maybe you don't have a diagnosis of cancer, but I'll guarantee you have cancer cells in you. Oh my gosh, does that mean I'm going to get cancer? No, hopefully not. Everybody's got cancer cells in them. And when those cells start rapidly replicating because something damaged the DNA inside the cell, your tumor suppressor genes kick on and your body causes that cell to go through apoptosis. Now, when you have a lot of defects in your tumor suppressor genes, your risk increases that you won't kick on a cell death process called apoptosis in that cell, and that cell can continue to replicate damaged cells and end up with a diagnosis of cancer. So with the BRCA genes and the MYC genes, the quote unquote fix for that, or the way to deal with that, is to increase curcumin, because that will increase apoptosis in cells and decrease inflammation in the tissue. So these are very common gene defects, so I wouldn't be concerned about them, but it's a good idea. That's why it's really good to run your genes, prior to having a serious disease. Getting your 12-year-old or 8-year-old genetic tests done can be really helpful, because then you can intervene before there's any issues, and you can help ward off issues. Good thing to do, just to be ahead of the curve, you could say. All right, that's the questions for this week. Thanks for attending. Make sure you put your questions in on the courses that you subscribe to, and we'll get this up on the website and as soon as it gets processed. Bye-bye.